Good morning, church. Coming to you up from the youth room, and right before a mural that Edie Meeks has painted for the youth group. And I just wanted to make sure everybody saw it. And we've been seeing the progression of the painting up in the youth room as she's been putting it on layer by layer. But a few weeks ago, she's put some of the finishing touches on it, and I just want to make sure the whole church gets to see and recognize just the beauty that she's put up on the walls, so we can be surrounded by just beauty of our own artist work up here in the youth room. And it's going to be beautiful to be able to worship here when we gather back and get to see just the magnificence that God's creativity has put into our own church, and that creativity can show through all the different talents that we have. Want to continue talking about what Arnis mentioned about treasuring and what a treasure looks like. And we go to a verse in Matthew 13:44, and Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found, and he covered it up. Then in his great joy, he goes and he sells all that he has, and he buys that field. So in this parable, talking about the kingdom of heaven, and as we look at it, we get the picture not of someone who's going to sell all their goods and earn their salvation, earn this great treasure that he's found, which is the kingdom of heaven. It's a man who realizes what a magnificent treasure he has found. And I think two stories that we can really look at in parallel here to really grasp the whole story of what's going on is in Mark 10:1, where a rich young ruler, he comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, I followed all the commandments. What more do you ask of me? And Jesus goes through, he's like, I haven't committed adultery. I haven't done this, and this. I've followed them all. And then Jesus tells him, go and sell everything that you have, and then you can follow me. And the rich young ruler, as we know, walks away despondent. So if we look at these two, the kingdom of heaven, I don't think particularly is just that place and that location, that gold medal that at the end of our life we get to wear it and go, okay, made it to heaven, check. If we look at the word kingdom in the original language, it's actually more of a dominion, more of a rulership. And if we also look at the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, we see that we're praying for God's kingdom to come and his will be done. And God's kingdom and his will are two things that are inseparable. There's no difference between his kingdom and his will, especially if we see his kingdom as a dominion, something where his will is imposed. So the kingdom of heaven is not just a personal salvation. It is a living in the midst of God's kingdom, God's will, God's dominion, rule. And if we see that when you find that we can live in that kingdom, we can live in his dominion, in his rule, then the joy that we have for that of getting the opportunity to live in his rule, in his kingdom, it makes us want to give up everything. It makes me want to sell everything and drop all of my personal cares and needs so I can follow God's kingdom, follow his rule. The beautiful thing is that God, he blesses us with his presence, that when we're in that kingdom, he takes care of our needs. He even makes sure that he tells us that don't be anxious for anything. The birds, they go this way and that way, and they don't worry about what they're going to eat. And the flowers, they don't worry about how they're going to dress, but in their dressing, it's more splendorous than what Solomon himself could do. And I think when we realize that living in God's kingdom gives us the blessing of God's presence, then we can start to live in that, and we can start to just let our lives pour out his kingdom, his rule, his dominion. And it's a dominion and it's a rulership of love. It's a dominion and rulership of lifting others' needs above ourselves. It's a rulership of selfless, sacrificial love, which Christ perfectly showed us on the cross. He showed us what it's like to live in God's kingdom at its finest. It's to serve. It's to look at your brothers and sisters and figure out how you can sacrifice whatever you have to lift them up and to give them something. To the point that Christ showed us that it was better for him to die so that we could live eternally instead of him just not having to go through the pain and just getting to preach a message and try to call everyone to us. He decided he wanted to give up his life to save us. And that is sacrificial kingdom living. It is living out the will of Christ. It's the treasure that this man found in the field. And I want to give a brief story of my past. There was a substitute teacher at Peyton, Colorado. His name was Mr. Skaggs, and his son, he was also a student there. And I remember Mr. Skaggs came up to me one day, and it was after class was done, but I was sitting back a little bit, and he came up to me and said, "Craig, do you want to know real magic?" And Mr. Skaggs, if the last name doesn't give it away, he has very untamed hair, and he had a scraggly beard, but the biggest heart in the world. And he said, "Craig, do you want to know real magic?" And I got a little concerned, wondering if he had some magic spell that he was not sharing with us. But he pulled me aside and he said, "Craig, do something for someone. Serve someone in some way and tell no one about it. That's true magic." And the more I thought about it, and the more I would practice that actually, and how biblical that teaching is, kingdom work is magical. There's something unearthly about God's kingdom and God's will, and it's serving others. It's doing to others what you would have done to yourself. And it's not letting your right hand know what your left hand's doing, and it's just this outpouring of self-sacrificing service, which again brings us back to what Arnis was preaching about this Sunday and what he taught us of. It's more blessed to give than receive. It's more blessed to live a life of service than to just live a life of receiving all of the blessings. So I want to encourage everybody to see how even in the midst of this time, even in the midst of when we feel isolated, how can we lift up one another above ourselves? How can we outdo one another in honoring, as Paul encourages us to do? We can outdo one another in honoring one another. I really think that we can find this treasure right now. I really think that we can hold on to this treasure and we can share it. We can live in the kingdom and we can share God's will and we can share his love, even though we feel very isolated and even though there might be some depression. We've had 5 straight days and maybe 6 and even more coming on of just overcast, rainy days. True treasure is finding God's kingdom, finding his will, and giving up everything to live in it and sharing it with others. And that's why it's way more blessed to give than to receive, because we're sharing God's love with others. And as we do that, we receive so much of God's love. I hope this is encouraging, and I hope that it can help inspire us to start lifting one another up in this time.